I would like to tell you how God saved me this evening. I suppose most everyone that's here tonight, you would understand that I was never raised in a Christian home. Now, when I say that, what I mean is this. My parents weren't saved and they weren't going to heaven, and I didn't know that a person had to be saved to go to heaven. I never knew that. I was not raised religiously. I was the third child of 6. I have one sister who follows me. I'm the only one saved out of my family. My father is gone. My mother has been a Jehovah's Witness for about 22 years. And she's down in Central America for that cult at this time. As I look back and I remember perhaps maybe some of the early days, I never thought about God. I never thought about anything. As I remember things. Although there was one thing that did get a hold of me when I was quite young, and that was this. There was something that I lost and never regained until shortly before I was saved. And that was I was afraid to die. I remember as a little boy, probably about 5, 6, I used to go to bed at night and I would have nightmares about dying and my body being in a casket and what would follow after that. And it used to terrify me, and I used to go down and my mother would take me in the old rocking chair and she'd rock me in the living room and she'd tell me everything was all right and teach me to pray that little expression, that parrot prayer, if I can use that expression. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep, and so on. That's the way I grew up. My mother used to take some of us children. When I was 8 years old, my father made her quit taking us to a little congregational church in the village of Steuben, Wisconsin. And my religious training amounted to coloring a few pictures. And I remember one thing that they had this, is you're sitting and looking this way. Way back up here on the wall, they had a figurine of Christ on the cross. And there were times before I was saved that I remembered that. Why, don't ask me. Didn't mean much to me. At the age of 8 years old, I said that my father made my mother quit taking us. I'd have to explain to you that my father was an alcoholic. I'd have to explain to you that my father was a very good man in many ways to many people. But I can tell you this, he was very, very hard on his family. He was a World War II veteran, receiving the Purple Heart from General de Gaulle. And my mother often told me that my father, when he returned after the war, was not the man that she married. I would only say that my father was exceedingly cruel to my mother. And he could be very, very cruel as well to his children. Now, I never received that end of it, but my 2 older brothers did. There were times, and I tell you, when I was 8 years old, I received a birthday present when I was 8. I learned to milk cows. In fact, 6 of them night and morning by hand when I was 8 years old. That was my birthday present. And there's another thing I learned when I was 8 years old, and that's this. And most of you people sitting in this meeting, you won't understand what I'm going to say. I hope you never find out either if you're not saved. I learned how to get drunk when I was 8 years old. And I remember going back in those early days that there were times, sometimes my father would take me down to the tavern and they'd get me drunk. And I remember times the big fellows, the adults, laughing while you staggered around and fell down. And my mother, she was never like that. And my mother was a very hard-working woman. She did the best she could. I'll say that for her. I surely would. My father never once told me that he loved me. I don't think he told anyone in the family that. And I'm sure my mother did, although I don't remember it. As I grew up, I can remember how startling it was to me to remember the first time it ever really dawned on me that my father wasn't like everybody else's father. And I oftentimes remember coming through the little town of Steuben on the school bus before we would get home, and there would be the pickup. Because my father always used to take the canned milk in cans. He used to take it to the factory in Steuben, cheese factory, and then he would stay there in the tavern all day until closing time. And we used to come home from school, and we used to do the chores, and we used to milk the cows, and that's the way I played every sport there was, and that's what I did when I got home after practice. And that's the way I grew up. There's a lot of things, dear friends, tonight I just can't tell you. I worked for myself, and I made my own money, besides working on the farm, and I never once had a person talk to me about my soul. I never heard a word until I was almost 18 years old. It was the first time anybody ever said a word to me that a person had to be saved to go to hell. When I was, going backwards for a moment, when I was 15 and a half years old, I remember coming home from basketball practice one night, and then I'd clean the barn and in the dark and that kind of thing, but this night was different. And when I walked into the kitchen, I saw there was blood on the floor. And I walked the kitchen and through the doorway into the living room, and my mother sat in the old rocking chair. And I'm telling you, my father had beaten her so bad, she wouldn't have been my mother, I wouldn't have known her. My oldest brother was gone. He was taking schooling in St. Louis as an airplane mechanic. And my next oldest brother had gotten in a fight with my father, and he had left. So was my mother, the younger children, and myself. And I almost made a critical mistake that night. And I'm not going to tell you what it was. But I almost did something I could have never been free from as long as I lived. And God stopped me. And from that day, I took a calendar and I marked off every day, every one of them, because I figured at the end of that year, I figured I could take my father with my bare hands. I'll only tell you this much. I did. And I regret that to this day. It was a good thing a friend of mine came the day it finally happened, because if he wouldn't have, I almost would have made another critical mistake. You see, for most of you here, I don't suppose you'd understand it if I told you that I hated my father. And that doesn't mean I disliked him. I'm telling you, I hated him. And I'm going to tell you this as well. I hated a lot of other things and a lot of other people too. There's nothing I loved to do more in those days than to take a fellow who was bigger than I am and just pound him to pieces. And I did it a lot. That's all I'll tell you. Back in those days, I learned how to fight, and I learned how to handle myself, what they call on the street, in a hick town, in a farming region. I had a teacher in high school. Nobody would have dreamed it. But that man came off the streets of Minneapolis. And I'm telling you, he could stand there. He did it with two of us one day. He stood in the class, and after everybody else had cleared out, he told this other man who was with me, he was a very good athlete. He and I were very good friends. He told him, he said, "Now you're going to stand there," he said, "and I'm going to tell you right now that I'm going to kick over your head." And he said, "I'll do it before you can move." And then he did it. Because he fought with razor blades in the tips of his shoes in the streets of Minneapolis. And I learned how to fight with brass knuckles. And I learned how to use chains. And a lot of other things. I was just a punk kid was all I was. Anyway, my mother left my father. And somebody had to milk the cows. So my mother was gone and the children were gone. And my father was working away on the road for a construction company during the week. And then he would come home on the weekends, but somebody had to be there, so I was there by myself, 16 years old. And I milked the cows and did what I wanted in between. And I did a lot of things that pretty much what I wanted to do. Except finally it came to an end because one time he came home on the weekend and he got himself good and drunk. And then he came to the barn while I was milking and he called my mother every rotten name in the book. And that was the end of me milking the cows right there. And I remember then I went to live in Wazeeka with my mother. And in all of this, school was all right. It was an amazing thing to me because the principal told me when I graduated from high school, he told me, he said, "Art," he says, "if you'd only just tried just a little," he said, "you'd have been a valedictorian." But that kind of thing didn't interest me at that time. I played every sport there was. I don't know if there's maybe a young person here and you're big on sports. Maybe you are. I can tell you something. I played every one there was. And when God saved me, I almost didn't take heed to when God spoke to me because I was playing ball 6 nights a week. And I almost missed it because of ball games. But back in those days, now I'm taking you back to the time now when I'm about 17 when I graduated, but in that senior year of high school, I met this young girl. She was 4 years younger than I was. All my classmates told me I was crazy to be interested in her. But you see, I didn't know it. And when I first met her parents, her father, the first thing he said to me, he said, "Hello, and you'd have to know my father-in-law." But he said to me, he says, "Are you saved?" And I thought, what in the world are you talking about? You must be crazy. You know, this fellow's talking to me about this, and then he ran off on a spiel about being saved and the Bible, and I thought, boy, you're nuts. That's what I thought. You're crazy. I didn't tell him that. It's amazing to me because after I got saved, the first time I talked to my sister, that's exactly what she told me. But you know, I just kind of passed that off, and I thought, oh, he's got a big bad case of religion, and so at any rate, even once in a while, like a foolish fellow would, so I could spend some time with my girlfriend, I used to go to some gospel meetings. And Mr. Paul Elliott, I remember him plain as day. He used to preach in the Millie Olson's garage in Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. And sometimes my girlfriend and her folks would be going up to these gospel meetings in this garage. I thought, boy, that was a strange thing. And he used to go and sit away in the back, you know, and I found out later after I got saved, I found out he figured those two back there, they'll never get saved. He'd given up hope on us. But a strange thing happened after I got out of high school. In fact, I carried on in a lot of things, and I got into smoking pot, and I didn't mess with hard drugs. I'll leave it at that. I knew lots of pushers. I knew lots of people who messed with heavy drugs. And I knew some of them, and some of them were friends of mine, and some of them were classmates of mine, and some of them went wrong and they never got back. I remember watching one time, we were going out of Wazeeka, Wisconsin, along the Kickapoo River, and as we were turning a corner, there were 3 or 4 of us, and out in front of us was a man I knew. He dealt in drugs constantly. He had big money. You could trace that fellow back through Chicago, back to Mexico, and I knew it. And he was ahead of us, and he was higher than a kite. And I said to the other fellows in the car, I said, listen, he's not going to make it. Because there was quite a sharp corner. And I knew the speed that man was traveling. I said, he isn't going to make it. And they fished his busted body out of a treetop by the Kickapoo River that night. I used to ride motorcycles, I'll tell you this, at 130 miles an hour, many a time. And I used to drive fast cars. Listen, lots of you here, maybe you're raised in a Christian home and you wouldn't understand, but you would think maybe, boy, if I could get away from home. I can tell you something. I had the very kind of things you probably would like to get into. I did anything. I wanted to. I went when I wanted to go. I didn't go if I didn't want to go. And I want to tell you something. It was miserable. It was absolutely miserable. I remember lots of times. There was this girl. I don't know why I'm telling you this, but we'll tell it and move on. There was a girl in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. She went to school, and some fellows fed her some what then came in. It was called angel dust. And I can tell you today, that girl, one time, and she still lives in an asylum to this day. I don't know. The chemistry must have been just right. That's all I know. But off in the end of all of those kind of things, there was this business about being saved, and who was God anyway? God to me was some figurine of some kind that was so abstract in my life that he didn't mean a thing to me. God? What did God ever do for me? Jesus Christ, what did he mean to me? He meant as much to me as George Washington being the first president of the United States, and that's it. I honestly can say that. God nor Christ meant nothing to me. I remember for some reason when I was a boy still on the farm, this comes back to me. One day, you can't understand, just full of anger and bitterness and hatred. I stood on a hayrack and I lifted my clenched fist to God, to heaven, standing a 16-year-old boy on a hayrack. And I said, if there's a God in heaven, strike me dead. But you see, back in those days, I remember I found my grandfather laying under a corn chopper. He'd been doing something under that chopper. And what had happened, I don't know how the thing got off the blocks, but the blades on that chopper cut his throat. And he laid there in that farmyard, and my grandmother and my mother were making dinner, and they sent me to get him. And I can still hear the whistle of the air coming out of his throat when he tried to breathe. I remember that just as vivid if it was right now. And and out of all those things, I wrestled with everything. And I was mad at the world. I was mad. Could have cared less. I couldn't begin to tell you how many, dozens and dozens and dozens of times I would come home in the middle of the night after what the world would think would be a lot of fun and a big party and all this kind of stuff, and lay there in a half-crazed state and think to myself, is this all that this life really is? Is this what it is? And many were the times I saw people all around me. You ever been in the midst of a big crowd, and yet in the middle of being in a group of a whole group of people, you're just as lonely as you could possibly be? I want to tell you something tonight. This world's an empty place. I want you to think with me for a few moments. The preaching of the gospel in meetings that I went to meant absolutely nothing. I couldn't tell you one thing that I remember. I suppose I went 20 times? I don't know. And whatever was preached in a gospel meeting didn't mean a thing. And many were the time I'd sit there and I'd look right at the preacher. But I was not interested, and that's all there was to it. I had no interest whatsoever. My girlfriend professed to be saved. That was a shock. And she changed. She was a big cheerleader and everything, and she quit that and a lot of other things. So at any rate, she went one way and I went another. And in the midst of all that went on for the next year and a half, I just did what I had done, only in a lot bigger fashion than I had done before. And one thing that came back to me was this. Mr. Steve Mick talked to me one time, and he read to me the end of Romans chapter 1. Men shall be backbiters, boasters, haters of God, and liars. There's a whole list of things. And I remember when he read that list to me, I remember thinking to myself, I've done almost every one of those things. And God brought that back to me about 2 years later. I just had been off to a motorcycle trip to Yellowstone. We stopped on the way to Mount Rushmore. And I don't know if it's even that way now. It's been a long time since I've been to Mount Rushmore. But I can tell you we went up during the day to see the faces. We went back down. There were 4 of us, 4 young men. And we started drinking. And I can only tell you that night we went back up. And all I can tell you is that you go up Mount Rushmore and then you turned off to the right to the faces and there was an island in the middle of that corner. And when we went up that day, there was no gravel in that corner. But when we went up that night, I had a passenger on the back. And all I can tell you is I had the scare of a lifetime. Because if you know anything about motorcycles, maybe somebody will. I rounded that corner and I don't know how fast I was going. I couldn't tell you. All I know, I was going too fast for a good corner. But when I hit that gravel, that bike skidded sideways on both tires, headed for that island, and I thought to myself, this is it. And if you know anything about bikes, you'll know something. When a bike starts to slide like that, you don't get it back. But somehow, that bike straightened up and came around, and I hit that island head on, and the bike bounced way in the air. And somehow that thing, I got to stop in the middle of that island, and I want to tell you, I was sweating. Because I'd laid a bike down many times. And I knew full well that what should have happened was that I should have hit that island broadside on the skid. And I and the girl on the back should have been flying through the air. And I knew that. We went on to Yellowstone from there, and we came back. And when we got back to Wisconsin, I'll only tell you this, what was in my mind. There came out of somewhere in the mist and the mixture of all the things that I had heard and all the things that I had seen and all the things that I had done came this one desire. If this business about being saved is real, then I'm going to find it out. And that was on a Saturday, and on that Sunday, I went to see Mr. Mick, who lived in Boscobel, Wisconsin, because I remembered what he had told me. God brought back the end of Romans chapter 1 to me. And I went to his home, and he wasn't there, on my motorcycle. And I went and knocked on the door, and his wife came to the door, and he was in Ohio having gospel meetings. And I asked her if there would be some way I could talk to him. She said, well, really, she said, unless you wanted to talk to him on the phone, she said, you'll have to wait until he gets back. But she said, you know, there's a gospel meeting tonight in Blue River, Wisconsin. And she said, you should go to that gospel meeting. And she gave me some gospel tracts. And so here I'm sitting on the bike, and it's a little past about 12:30, 1 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. And I thought to myself, well, I don't know where this building is in Blue River. I'll go and find it. I had nothing else to do. So I went down there in the motorcycle and wheeled up and down the streets of Blue River, and I couldn't find the gospel hall in the big town of Blue River. And I remember I went over and I I said to myself as I was going along, I said, the next street, I'll go up this street, and if I don't see the gospel hall, the first person I see, I'm going to ask them where it is. So I wheeled up this street, and sure enough, here's this old man walking across the yard. He's carrying a bucket in his left hand. That's just as clear to me. I could see him. He was hobbling. He had something wrong with a knee. And the street was right here. I was going this direction, and the street went this way, so I wheeled over like this and pulled over and stopped the motorcycle, and I said to him, "Sir, can you tell me where the gospel hall is in this town?" And sure enough, wouldn't you know, here I'd gotten a hold of Alex Stanitka. He'd been saved for almost 50 years. And he put that bucket down, and I'm telling you, he preached to me. It must have been, I don't know how long. But he gave me a good one. But I'll tell you, when it was all said and done, he said one thing that registered, and that was this. He said, you got to know my name, Art, he says, booming voice. He says, I wouldn't trade all the gold and all the world and all the gold and all the silver and all the world for my salvation. And I want to tell you something. The world I lived in before that, I lived in a dream world. People didn't talk about things that were really real, you know what I mean? And this old man, as he hobbles across the yard and he stops and he starts to talk to me and all this business, I went away that day on the motorcycle and I went back to Wazeeka, Wisconsin, where I was staying in an apartment by myself. And the only thing I can remember that this old man told me was I wouldn't trade all the gold and all the silver and all the world for my salvation, and I knew he meant it. And I want to tell you, that spoke volumes to me. I knew that man meant what he had to say. So I went to the meeting that night, and I can tell you something. I walked into the old Blue River Gospel Hall, parked the bike outside. They must have heard it. And there they were, and they were thinking about what was going on, you know. And you know how it is. I walked into that old Gospel Hall, and there's all these Christians sitting in there. And I put my helmet on the shelf out there in the thing. They must have heard the clunk, they heard the bike, and they all turned around and looked right at me. And I thought, wow, this is really something. You know, so I sat down, I found my perch in the rear end of that building and sat down, and couldn't tell you who preached. I couldn't tell what they read. I couldn't tell you a thing, honestly. I don't remember one thing about that gospel meeting, except they didn't have an organ in there, and they didn't have a lot of things. And they had these verses on the wall. I had verses on the wall, and I remember that, and that's it. And I went away, back to Wazeeka, and the next morning, because work was going well, things were going well with Advanced Transformer Company in the plant in Boscobel, Wisconsin, I had to go into work early. And wouldn't you know, the man who worked third shift maintenance was in the cafeteria. There were only 2 people in there. I got there early, and so I went in, and I sat down, and that man, he got up, he was sitting way over on the other side of the cafeteria, and I got something, and I went over and I sat down on this side of the cafeteria. And that fellow got up, and he walked all the way down there. I thought to myself, what's he want? And he came all the way down there, and he sat right down across from me, and he reached into his pocket, and he pulled out, of all things, the New Testament. And he sat right there across from me, and he looked me right in the eyes, and he said, are you saved? And I looked at him, and God must have made me honest, because I told him, no, I'm not. You see, he had to work third shift maintenance, and Ray Dearborn couldn't be at the meeting in Blue River on Sunday night because he had to work. And he didn't know that I'd been at that gospel meeting. And God put him and I in that cafeteria, and he sat down right across from me and looked me right in the eyes and asked me if I was saved. And then he opened up that New Testament and he read verses to me. I don't remember any that he read. And I went out and I started to run the machine that I ran, and there was a woman who worked down the way from me when she came in at the regular time, and I talked to her different times. I used to be a bartender, and I served her many a drink. And I used to talk with her, and you know, at John I didn't want to talk to her. And then there's these women that went down there to the gospel hall, and they wore dresses, you know, and they came in there and they worked in that place. And I want to tell you something, that was kind of a rugged place anyway, and here were these women, and then they come back there and they talked to me, and they gave me gospel tracts, and they said they were praying for me. I thought, oh, what in the world? I didn't know what to say. You know something? From that day on, that was a Monday, I can tell you something that started happening the next days. I started taking all the gospel tracts that people had given me, and the Bible that my folks had been given as a wedding present that I got from my mother, so I could look up the verses in the gospel tracts, because I didn't know Genesis from Revelation. I started taking the Bible and the tracts to work with me. And I want to tell you, when I came in, They punched the clock. And there I had that Bible in my hand with a bunch of gospel tracts. A lot of the fellows I drank with and fought with and rode bikes with. Those boys stood there and laughed at me. I'm going to tell you something. I could have cared less. Because there was one thing that had come into my life, and that was if I could be saved, I'd like to be. If this thing is really real, I want to know. So I read the tracts and I looked them up in the Bible, and lots of different things happened. And finally come Thursday night, they even got a hold of Mr. Dobson, who was having meetings in Bridgeport, Wisconsin with Mr. Shad Kimber Sr. And they got a hold of him, and he came to where I was living after work and met me and talked to me. And I can only tell you that he asked me a bunch of questions. I don't know how I answered them. And all I knew is that by the look in that man's eyes, I must have been a long way off. And that's all I could remember. And I went that night, that was Thursday. I told you one night in a gospel meeting here that there was a good friend of mine, a big buddy of mine, and he came that night, that Thursday night, and he knocked on the door and wanted me to go partying with him. And I told him, Steve, I'm not going. I said, I have found out, and the verse that God used to trouble me was this verse, Romans 3:10, for there is none righteous, no, not one. And I got to thinking, if I'm not righteous, I didn't have any problem with that. I knew as a sinner, but what I never knew was that my sins were taking me to hell. And when I found out that there is none righteous, no, not one, I found out that everybody else was in the same boat I was. But you see, that night when I didn't go, unknown to me, totally unknown to me, because God was dealing with me and I didn't know it. And I stayed there and I read those tracts again. I went through all those tracts. I looked up all those verses. I went to bed with the Bible and the tracts. I fell asleep with the light on. And when I woke up, as it happened to be through the course of the night as it turned out to be, I can tell you only this happened. The only thing that crossed my mind was, if I die as I am, I will be in hell. And I want to tell you something, my friends, it was the most miserable time in my life. And I fell asleep, I read more verses, and I looked them up in the Bible again, and I read till I fell asleep again, and then when I woke up, the first thing that crossed my mind, if I die as I am, I'll be in hell. And that happened to me all night long. And it was the first thing that I thought of when I got up in the morning. Listen, there was nobody pumping me. It was just God and me. And I didn't have a Christian mother and a Christian father praying for me. And I didn't have any friends that I could go to, or at least I didn't have any that I would have trusted. And I want to tell you something. Through all the muck and mire of my life, God stripped me. And I had vowed in my unsaved days there'd never be a man who would break me. You wouldn't believe that, because I'm not very big, but I want to tell you something. There was only one way that anybody would have ever broken me. Only one. But you see, when I started to wrestle with that thing, I got a hold of two things. I'm a sinner. I deserve to go to hell. Jesus Christ died for sinners, then why can't I say I'm saved? It worked for everybody else. And sitting there and going over those things, I woke up in the morning and again I read verses in the Bible. I read and I looked at the Bible and I took them with me to work when it came time to go. And when I got to work, I went in there again and I went into the men's bathroom. And listen, this is what I thought. This is it. This is when I'm going to be saved. And I went in the men's bathroom and I got down on my knees for the first time in my life. And I asked God to save me. And then I waited for a feeling, a flash of light, some big thing to happen to tell me that I was saved. You know what happened? Absolutely nothing. And going away from that place, I thought to myself, I didn't know what to think. And I went away, time came to start to work, and I did, and this lady from just down the way, she must have been watching me, and I didn't know it. She came up to me, it was a mid-morning or so. She said to me, she said, Art, what's wrong with you? I said, Kate. She said, you sick? I said, no. She said, you look sick. She said, you better go see the nurse. She said, there's something awful wrong with you. You don't look good. I said, Kate, I found out I'm going to hell. And if I don't get saved, that's where I'm going to be. I can still see her yet. She died with cancer this fall. She threw her hands in the air. She said, oh, you're getting religious. Away she went. She never did get saved. And I talked to her a lot. And I'm there, standing by that machine. I was going over, I'm a sinner, and I know that I deserve to go to hell because of what I've done. Christ died for sinners. Why? Oh, why can't I say I'm saved? And there, standing by that machine that day, I'll tell you something. Must have been getting on towards noon. And I was trying to put those pieces together like 2 plus 2 equals 4, and I couldn't do it. It wasn't real. And standing by that machine, it finally came to me, Art, you've done everything you can do. You've looked at every verse. You've looked at everything that you can get your hands on. And you never will be saved. And I walked away from that machine over to a wall that was right over here. And there was a table just a little bit bigger than this. And the Bible was right here. And those tracts sat right there. I sat down on the stool at that table. And I looked at the Bible and I looked at the tracts and I thought, what's the use? What's the use in ever looking at these things again? Because will never, ever be saved. I'll never be saved. I want to tell you something. That was the darkest moment in my life. And sitting there in that chair, for some reason, I reached over and picked up a little gospel tract that lay on the top of that pile. And with my left hand, I just turned it over on the back side, and there on the back of that verse, on that tract, was this verse. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved, and thy house. And sitting there in that chair, that verse came to me like this. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. I thought to myself, God doesn't want me to pray. God doesn't want my money. God doesn't want me to work. God's not asking me to do anything but to trust His Son as my Savior. And the next few words, they jumped off the page at me almost. And thou shalt be saved. And I'm telling you right there, I knew God was telling me that I was saved. I'm going to tell you something. I didn't cry. And I didn't sit there. I thought to myself, I'll be frank, this is what I thought. I thought, man alive, can this be true? Can it really be that simple? And I thought to myself, I got off that chair because I remembered I heard people tell me how they got saved and they knew the time on the clock. And they said, and they looked at the thing, and they looked at that thing and this is what they said. You know, they said the time and all this, and I walked down past that tube rack, and this big clock in the factory, there it was, and it said 10 minutes to 12. And friends, I got saved July 26th of 1974, about 10 minutes to noon, 10 minutes to 12. And I went off up the way around the corner. I got a hold of Kate, and I said, Kate, I got saved. She looked at me, I tell you, said it was the strangest thing she probably ever heard, I don't know. And I went around the corner, I went up by the big cafeteria, and the machine was running. I could have cared less, I don't care. And I went up the way, and I met Buzz Cornell. He was my boss. And he and I drank together, and rode bikes together, and did a lot of things. And I met him right by the water fountain, and I said to him, Buzz, I said, you and I won't be going to any parties together anymore. I said, God just saved me right back there by the two-pointer. I'm telling you, you could have blew him over with a feather. He looked like somebody hit him in the head with a 2x4. But I want to tell you to this day, Buzz Cornell remembers the day that I got saved. And you know, my friends, not only was it getting saved, I want to tell you one other thing, because Brother Peter and I talked about this before the meeting. I want to tell you what happened after that. That night, listen, I didn't go home to parents, and I didn't go home to lots of things. I'll tell you what I went home to. I went home to an empty apartment. And I went downtown that night, and I went into the tavern. Was I saved? I sure was. Did I know it? Yes, I did. And I went into the tavern, and I sat down, and I ordered a can of pop. And the next thing I knew, a bunch of my buddies came in, my old buddies. And the next thing I knew, some of them had bought a round of beer. So they come and they set this bottle of beer in front of me. And it's just like it was almost like an audible voice, but it wasn't, okay? Said, Art Ward, you don't belong in this place anymore. And I am thankful to God. I got up and I walked out and I've never been back. I want to tell you something. Getting saved is the best thing in the world. I'll tell you something. I wish that you were hungry for it, soul. Because I can tell you that Jesus Christ, means more to me than anything. My wife and I took my father into our home. He had an abscess in his lung. He got out of the hospital and we took him into our home. And I want to tell you something. My wife treated him like a king. And I'll only tell you this. I told my father that I loved him. And the only way that could have ever come out of me is if the love of God had been shed abroad in my heart by the Holy Spirit. And I'll tell you the thing that haunts me the most to this day. I read with my father. I prayed with my father. And my father would sit and he would listen to me. But my father never got saved. And I saw him the night before he died. The most bitter thing that I've ever known since I've been saved is the fact that I couldn't win him. Just a few hours before he died, this is what he told me. He said, Art, he said, you can think that way. He said, you can believe that. But he said, oh, I just cannot believe that way. If you're raised in a Christian home, you treasure it, will you? You treasure it. Because I can tell you this, you have no idea what this world can do to you. And when the end of this is all over, the only thing that's worthwhile is if you're saved. That's all that matters. May God help you. Does God mean what he says in his word? He sure does. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved, and thy house.